When a man accidentally digs up an old watch in his garden, he takes it to a jeweler to have it valued. But instead of helping him, the man calls the cops. What unfolds after that is an adventure for the ages. Jake wiped the sweat from his brow as he dug into the earth in his yard on the outskirts of Chicago. He was preparing a spot for the new oak sapling he'd bought. As his shovel bit into the soil, it suddenly struck something hard. Jake knelt down and brushed away the dirt with his hands. After some effort, he pulled out an old, tarnished watch. The intricate design hinted at something valuable, something with a story. Jake carefully wrapped the old watch in a cloth. He was curious about its ornate design and decided to take it to Arthur's Jewelers. The shop was run by Arthur, an elderly jeweler with a reputation for his expertise, especially regarding historical items. He would be the ideal person to shed some light on the watch's value. Arthur's eyes widened slightly as he unwrapped the cloth. The intricate design and age of the piece were immediately apparent, but Jake noticed a change in Arthur's demeanor. The jeweler's usually steady hands trembled slightly, and his face grew pale. Arthur's calm professionalism gave way to a visible tension. "This is quite an old piece," he said. His voice betrayed an unease Jake hadn't expected. "Where did you say you found it?" Jake recounted the story of discovering the watch buried in his garden. He noticed Arthur's increasing discomfort as he spoke. The jeweler inspected the watch more closely. His fingers brushed over the engravings with obvious anxiety. "I'm afraid I can't give you an appraisal right now," Arthur said abruptly. His gaze shifted nervously toward the back room. "I need to make a phone call." Without waiting for Jake's response, he quickly excused himself and retreated into the office section of the shop. Jake stood there, puzzled and increasingly uneasy. Why had Arthur reacted so strangely? What was so significant about this watch that warranted such a reaction? After several more minutes of waiting, Jake grew impatient. He decided to leave. His curiosity still burned, but it was tempered by a growing sense of unease. Determined to uncover the mystery behind the old watch, Jake decided to take matters into his own hands. Arthur's strange reaction had only fueled his curiosity. He began by researching the watch's possible origins. His first stop was the local library. He approached the reference desk and asked the librarian for any resources on antique watches or historical items related to Chicago's past. Jake sifted through dusty volumes and yellowed newspapers. After a few hours, he'd found nothing directly related to the watch. But just as he was about to give up, he spotted an old book titled Chicago's Underworld, The Gangsters of the 1930s. It looked worn and neglected, but something about it caught his eye. He carefully pulled it from the shelf and flipped through the pages, scanning for anything that might match the ornate design of his watch. As Jake turned the pages, he stumbled upon a chapter dedicated to notorious criminals of the era. The chapter featured a photograph of Tony Two Fingers Moretti, a well-known henchman of Al Capone. Moretti had been infamous for his ruthless activities and had mysteriously disappeared in the 1930s. Jake's heart raced as he saw a photograph of Moretti wearing a watch that matched the description of the one he had found. The style, the engravings, even the tarnish. It was all identical. Jake's excitement grew as he continued reading. The book detailed Moretti's rise through the ranks of Chicago's criminal underworld, his involvement in various criminal activities, and his eventual disappearance. Despite numerous investigations, Moretti's whereabouts had remained a mystery. The book mentioned rumors of a hidden fortune and secret stashes of money and valuables, but nothing had ever been definitively proven. Jake's mind raced with the implications. If the watch was indeed Moretti's, it could be a crucial piece of the puzzle in solving his long-unsolved disappearance. He realized that the watch might hold the key to a long-forgotten mystery, potentially leading to new revelations about one of Chicago's most notorious criminals. Fueled by this newfound knowledge, Jake spent the whole day diving deeper into the subject. He visited historical archives, scoured old newspapers, and even reached out to local historians. His research revealed more about Moretti's life and the criminal network he was part of. Jake learned about the various hideouts and safe houses used by Moretti and his associates, some of which were located on the outskirts of Chicago. Still determined to get answers, he returned to Arthur's Jewelers the next day. His mind was still reeling from the revelations of the past day, the watch's possible connection to Tony Two Fingers Moretti, the hidden warehouse, and the tantalizing clue of the safe. When he heard the door, Arthur straightened up and turned around. His face paled slightly and his eyes darted to the back room as if he were considering whether to retreat. He took a deep breath and nodded, gesturing for Jake to follow him. The jeweler led him to a small, cluttered office at the back of the shop. It was filled with antique tools and dusty paperwork. Arthur closed the door behind them. All right, sir. I can see you're serious, but I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is not something to take lightly. Jake didn't wait for Arthur to continue. He said he'd done some research. He said he believed the watch Arthur wouldn't appraise belonged to Tony Moretti. He added that he'd found evidence linking it to the gangster. Arthur glanced nervously around the room. Tony Moretti? That name brings back some dark memories. The watch is indeed connected to him, but there's more to it than just being a valuable piece of history. Arthur's hands trembled slightly as he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. You see, the watch is rumored to be cursed. It was said to have been a part of Moretti's collection, but there's a legend attached to it. People believe that the watch leads to a treasure, but many who have tried to find it have met untimely and tragic ends. Jake's skepticism battled with his growing unease. Arthur's expression was grave. It's not just superstition. There have been numerous reports of people dying under mysterious circumstances after coming into contact with the watch, or trying to find the treasure it's supposed to lead to. My dad knew Moretti personally, and I can tell you, he was a man who attracted trouble. Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He asked why Arthur hadn't told him this on his first visit. Arthur's voice lowered, almost to a whisper. Because it's not just a story. The last thing I want is to see someone else get hurt. I've seen too many people get consumed by their greed and their desire to uncover the treasure. It's a dangerous path. Jake's determination didn't waver. He said he wasn't backing down now. He needed to know more. Then he asked where he could find out about the so-called curse and the treasure. Arthur sighed heavily. Again, he glanced toward the door as if he expected someone to burst in. If you're set on this path, I can't stop you. But you should know that the trail won't be easy. The treasure is said to be hidden in places connected to Moretti's operations. And finding it will put you in the crosshairs of those who are still seeking it. Just as Arthur finished speaking, Jake noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A police car parked outside the shop. Its presence was conspicuous, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. The timing seemed too coincidental. Arthur followed his gaze and tensed. Looks like the police have arrived. I had no choice but to call them the last time you were in here. You might want to be careful. The watch and its history are sensitive subjects. Jake's mind raced. Was the old jeweler delivering him to the police? But before the doors of the shop could let the cops in, Arthur pushed Jake towards the back of the store, ushering him out of a back door. Shocked by the sudden assistance, Jake ran away without looking back. He needed to find something that could lead him to Moretti, and he needed to do it as soon as possible. His investigation led him to an old, derelict warehouse on the outskirts of Chicago. The structure was a massive, crumbling building that had been abandoned for decades. Once a bustling hub during the Prohibition era, it was now a shadow of its former self, overrun with weeds and graffiti. The warehouse's connection to Tony Two Fingers Moretti and the recent revelations about the cursed watch had fueled his determination to uncover more. He managed to gain access through a broken side door. The warehouse was filled with dust-covered relics from a bygone era. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, Jake began his search. 30 minutes later, he found a concealed door in the back corner of the warehouse. It was partially hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates, almost as if it were trying to stay out of sight. He pulled the crates away and pried the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. Its walls were lined with shelves filled with more old documents and dusty artifacts. As he stepped into the room, Jake's flashlight beam fell upon a dusty armchair. On it was a tattered map. Jake could hardly believe what he was seeing. The map depicted a series of locations around Chicago, marked with cryptic symbols and annotations. The realization hit him hard. This map could be the key to finding Moretti's hidden treasure. It pointed to Moretti's legendary fortune, waiting to be uncovered. Then he felt a chill down his spine. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and a sense of unease crept over him. He had been so focused on the map that he hadn't noticed the faint sounds of footsteps coming from the warehouse. Jake's instincts kicked in. He quickly folded the map and tucked it into his jacket. He could sense that someone or something was watching him. The footsteps grew louder. Jake tried to find a way out of the room before he was caught. He retraced his steps through the maze of crates and debris. As he neared the exit, the footsteps stopped abruptly. Jake's pulse quickened. He peeked around the corner, but the warehouse remained silent and empty. The feeling of being watched lingered. He made his way back to the side door and cautiously stepped outside. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the oppressive atmosphere inside. Jake took a deep breath and looked around, but there was no sign of anyone. He quickly headed to his car. Whoever had been following him might still be out there, watching and waiting. As he drove away from the warehouse, His thoughts were consumed by the map and its implications. The discovery of the map had made him acutely aware of the possible dangers of his adventure. His thoughts were interrupted by the sudden flash of police lights in his rearview mirror. The red and blue lights swirled and flickered. Jake's heart raced as he pulled over. 2 officers approached his vehicle. One tapped on his window and signaled for Jake to roll it down. "Evening, sir. Can you step out of the vehicle, please?" Jake complied. The other officer began to inspect the interior of Jake's car. "We received a call about a possible break-in at the warehouse," the first officer said. "We've been following up on leads. Mind telling us what you were doing there?" Jake's stomach dropped. He said he wasn't breaking in, that he'd found the place by accident. He was just investigating something he discovered in his garden. The officers exchanged a glance. "What did you find?" the second officer asked. Jake hesitated, but then decided to be honest. He told them about the old watch, and about Arthur's reaction, and that he'd gone to the warehouse to see if he could find more information about the watch. The first officer raised an eyebrow. "And what did you find there?" Jake took a deep breath. He said he found some old relics and a map, and added that the place was abandoned. There was no one else there. The officers looked skeptical. "We've had reports of a series of unsolved murders in the area. The watch you found might be linked to those cases. There have been rumors of a gang looking for Moretti's treasure, and we think you might be involved." Jake said it was absurd. He was just an ordinary guy who found a watch. He had nothing to do with any murders or gangs. The officers didn't seem convinced. They placed Jake in handcuffs and read him his rights. "You're being detained for questioning," the first officer said. "We need to verify your story." The drive to the precinct was tense. What had started as a quest for historical knowledge had turned into a nightmare. How had the watch become linked to recent Why were the police so convinced he was involved? At the precinct, Jake was ushered into an interrogation room. The officers grilled him about his background, his activities, and his connection to the watch. Jake explained everything he had done: finding the watch, taking it to the jeweler, discovering the warehouse. He detailed his encounter with the jeweler and how he had left the store with more questions than answers. The officers listened intently but remained unconvinced. "We have reports that Moretti's watch was part of a collection connected to organized crime," the first officer said. The jeweler's reaction was suspicious. "He's been known to have connections with criminal circles." Jake shook his head. He said he didn't know anything about organized crime. He certainly wasn't involved with any gangs. He was just trying to understand the watch's history. Hours passed as the interrogation continued. Jake's frustration grew. He had no way to prove his innocence, and no proper explanation for his presence at the warehouse, except for what he had already told them. But the more he tried to explain, the more it seemed like he was digging himself deeper into a hole. Just as Jake was beginning to lose hope, the door to the interrogation room opened and a new detective walked in. "I'm Detective Harris. I've been briefed on your case." She took a seat opposite Jake and reviewed the notes from the earlier questioning. "Jake, I need you to start from the beginning. Tell me everything you remember about finding the watch and visiting the warehouse." Jake did as instructed and recounted every detail with as much clarity as possible. Detective Harris listened carefully and occasionally made notes. After he finished, she sat back, deep in thought. "I'm going to need to verify your story," Detective Harris finally said. "We'll look into the jeweler's background and the recent murders. For now, we'll need to hold you until we can confirm your involvement, or lack thereof." Jake's heart sank. This situation was far from resolved. As he was led to a holding cell, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was entangled in something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The watch, the warehouse, and the police involvement had transformed his ordinary life into a thrilling and terrifying mystery. The search for answers had become perilous. Detective Harris carefully reviewed his statements and checked the facts, but Jake's fate remained uncertain. Suddenly, she returned to the room. In her hands was a small, velvet-lined box. She placed it on the table in front of Jake. "This," she said, opening the box, "is why we were so concerned about that watch." There was a watch in the box, identical to the one he'd found in his backyard. The detective carefully lifted it out and held it up to the light. It was still the same old timepiece Jake had found, but something about it seemed different now. "During our investigation," Detective Harris continued, "we discovered a second watch. This one is the real thing. The key to the Moretti mystery. Yours was the one he wore. This one is from the warehouse. You see, it has a hidden slit." She gently pried open a small concealed latch on the side of the watch. With a delicate click, a tiny compartment popped open. Inside was a rolled-up piece of parchment. Jake's heart raced as the detective unfolded the parchment. On it was a series of cryptic symbols and numbers. "This message," Harris explained, "has been the subject of much speculation. It's said that those who sought to decode it ended up dead, their attempts thwarted by the so-called curse. Jake looked at the coded message and tried to figure out what it said. "We've been working with cryptographers to crack the code," Harris said. "It's been challenging, but we've managed to decode part of it." She handed Jake a typed transcript of the decoded message. It read, "In the shadow of the old mill where the river bends, beneath the stone marked with a lion's head, lies the fortune." For Jake, the pieces of the puzzle were all there now, but they refused to slide into place. Harris said, "We believe the murders were linked to people who had tried to decipher this message. The so-called curse was simply a warning to those who got too close. Moretti hid his fortune before his death, and this watch was the key to finding it." Jake began to understand. The watch certainly wasn't cursed. It was a clue to a hidden treasure. Arthur's reaction now made sense, Harris continued. Arthur must have known about the treasure and the dangers associated with it. His fear had stemmed from knowing how valuable and dangerous the watch was. His dad was involved in the criminal world, and he knew the history of the watch. He knew that once the watch came into the wrong hands, it would attract unwanted attention. The fact that you found it and went to him made him fear the worst. Jake sighed and asked what was next. Harris smiled faintly. "We're going to investigate the location mentioned in the message. Your involvement in this case will be cleared once we verify your story." As he drove home a few hours later, Jake was still trying to piece together everything. The watch had brought him face to face with a dangerous past, and he had come dangerously close to being entangled in its shadows. The chilling reminder of Moretti's fate loomed large in his mind. It made him shudder at the thought of what might have happened if he had pursued the mystery further. Once home, he walked to the spot where he had found the watch. Determined to put the past behind him, Jake grabbed a spade from the shed and began digging. He dug a small hole in the corner of the garden, not far from where he had found the watch. With each shovelful of dirt, he felt a growing sense of release. He was burying the watch and the memories and turmoil that came with it. He was making a deliberate choice to let it go. Jake filled the hole and tamped down the soil. Then he brushed his hands clean. It was over now. But the adventure with the watch that tied back to the heyday of Chicago's gangster past would linger a while yet. Would you have stopped investigating as well? Do you have a story of someone finding something historical that led to an adventure? Tell us about it in the comments. We'd love to hear. For now, though, we're out of here. Catch you in the next video.